Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to see you all here. Now, the first and most obvious question that comes to mind when you're presented with a volume that purports to revisit a much older work, Women, Islam and the State, must surely be why and why now? Now, some of the reasons are personal. Two of them are sitting right here. Some of them are in the audience, like Naila Kabir, who kept on at me for years about doing this, and who is, by the way, the only contributor from the previous volume with us. And of course, all the other contributors who are very dear to me, each in their own terms. So to introduce them, if you don't mind, to make yourself known, I will start with, by order of seating, Nazanin Shakrani, who did the Iran chapter. If you would get up. I just wanted to know who has been involved in the project. Torun Wimpelman, who's sitting right by her side. Nadia Tahir, who is right at the back there. Heba Al-Kholi should be joining us, who was also involved on the chapter in Egypt, but I believe she's still on her way from the airport. And this is it. There is also Afia Zia, who did Pakistan, Madawi Al-Rashid, who did the chapter on Saudi Arabia,
Islah Jad.
And Islah Jad, who can unfortunately not be with us, who did the book on Palestine, but who I'm glad to say was shortlisted for a book prize on Palestine based on the work she did there, which is reflected in this chapter. So, coming to the present volume, in many ways, I think that in spite of the generational span separated the two volumes, their goals are actually strikingly similar. In each case, what we were trying to do is make an intervention, try to interrogate and unsettle some key conceptual categories that have a way of becoming conventional wisdom, which reflects, if you want, the spirit of an era, if you want to put it that way. Now, in both cases, when we wrote Women, Islam and the States and now, we witness epochal changes that required shifts in perspective, if not a paradigm shift, in fact. Now, you will remember that Women, Islam and the State was the product of a period of post-colonial nation building, where states with still developmental pretensions were defining modernization and national development in ways that attempted to include women into a definition of citizenship. So WIS, for short, represented an attempt to bring the state back in and to show how the vagaries of very different nation-building projects and the ways in which they articulated with Islam produced very different outcomes, which were illustrated by the case studies in the first book. Now, Gender, Governance and Islam attempts to evaluate the effects of what I consider to be a seismic shift. All the tectonic plates have shifted in between, and none of the terms that informed the initial debate are there. They're all transformed. These shifts involved shifts in feminist theory itself, where we had the shift from women to gender, which underwrote very different types of mobilization and gender activism, which now includes sexual liberties, platforms, and so on. I have to tell you that those of us who came around this book were not able to deal with what I would consider the full spectrum of contemporary gender activism. Most of us were women working on women's movements and policies on women's rights, and we stuck to what we know best, not least because women's rights platforms are under constant assault and marginalized in the countries where we worked. So, you know, this was no luxury. Secondly, we had major shifts in our understanding of governance, because there has been the developments after the first book, the neoliberal transformations of the 1980s, the geopolitical convulsions in the aftermath of the 2001 attacks on the United States, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. This launched a complete transformation of the regional order, the propagation of so-called failed or weak states with lack of control over vast territories and populations, cohabiting with powerful non-state actors, acting as virtual states, as we had with the Taliban in Afghanistan, ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and so on. And of course, creating the ideal circumstances for external interferences. That meant that the boundaries between the subnational, national, and transnational levels became ever more porous, as we shall hear quite soon from Catherine's presentation on transnational Islam. So basically, the long-term legitimacy crises that were created by these transformations and the rearticulation of state-society relations over a long period of time created a resurgence of grassroots Islamist movements in the Arab region and beyond, culminating in the upheavals of the Arab uprisings and their continuing aftermath. This is the background. Now, when we look at the academic literature, we see that there has been a persistent and pervasive preoccupation with the geopolitics of imperialism and its effects on struggles for gender equality and women's rights. So the emphasis has been on the inroads that were made by what some scholars called global gender equality regimes, which is the dispositif which has been put into place by the United Nations, its various specialist agencies, and various multilateral and bilateral donors, which led to donor-assisted platforms, which I distinguish from women's movements, which I called donor-directed gender activism, which is a slightly different category. Now, these entanglements have been the focus of a great deal of literature, which brought, of course, the old chestnut of feminism as a handmaiden of imperialism, right? Now, we found ourselves in the midst of these debates when we started this volume, and what we have tried to show very much is that it is ultimately internal struggles over control, identity, and legitimacy in the context of very different types of global entanglements that play a decisive role in setting the parameters of the politics of gender. Now, the way we did that was by using a continuum of cases which illustrate the interplay between the global and the local. So on one end of the continuum, we have fragmented societies that are still in the grip of ongoing conflict, such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and of course the unresolved question of Palestine. Now, it is quite clear that these settings are characterized by much more direct interventions by global governance institutions, and of course they live much larger footprints. We also have the case of Pakistan that has been directly affected by conflict and the blowback of the war on terror. We have the cases of Turkey and Egypt, which have been the setting of popular upheavals and regime change, and the cases of Saudi Arabia and Iran, which, although seemingly appear as a continuity of regime persistence, in fact show that this is not the case and that there have been a lot of fractures and a lot of changes. So through this array of cases, we attempt to bring in new ways of analyzing that break with the shackles, well, we thought were the academic shackles of West Islam, secularism, Islam, etc., etc. We started to think of these concepts as so many carbuncles on the hull of the boat we were trying to move forward. They were dragging us down, closing our conceptual horizons. We wanted to be rid of them. basically. And so we did it in the only way we knew, painstakingly, building, and this is Heba El-Honi, by the way, who did, who was involved in the chapter on Egypt. So basically, that is how we proceeded, from the ground up, without some, also I think implicitly arguing against mega theories. Are NGOs good or bad? It depends. Are, UN programs good or bad? Where? Under what conditions, okay? That's what we did. But also, something that cuts across all the cases and that they have in common is an analysis of the effects of the efforts of power holders to enforce gender hierarchies and uphold male privileges on the one hand, and the diverse patterns of grassroots resistance and periodic accommodation by the power holders on the other. And that we have in every chapter. Examples, for example, of grassroots resistance range from individual acts of rebellion, such as Saudi women fleeing the strictures of the male guardianship system, although these, as you know, became a diplomatic headache eventually for the Saudi government, to iconoclastic online activists in Pakistan breaking sexual taboos, to collective dissent through protests on the streets of Istanbul, Cairo, and Tehran. Now, what we had a glimpse of in expressions of dissent and contentious politics was an unprecedented level of societal polarization that pits people in those societies who acquiesce and uphold authoritarian rule and strongman leadership on the one hand, against men and women who recognize aspirations to gender equality as part and parcel of a package of demands for democratic representation, human rights, and pluralism. So I think, I may be over-optimistic, but I do think that it is now possible to talk about cross-gender alliances around anti-authoritarian politics versus a politics which I call a politics of masculinist restoration. Not patriarchy, but masculinist restoration, because I have no time to argue this, but I am saying that patriarchy as we know it is defunct, and that what we now see is a much more vicious, reactive politics. Now, as the project was coming to a close and I was mulling over these thoughts towards the end of our project, we were yet again overtaken by history. So much academic, no, it is true, so much academic writing and critique was premised on the assumption of a purportedly immutable, hegemonic liberal order. Yet, the assumed liberalism of the so-called West was being put to the test by a wave of illiberal right-wing populisms right in the heartland of the West, in North America, in Europe, Central and Eastern Europe in particular, but Europe in general, and reinstating rigid gender hierarchies and racial hierarchies lies at the heart of these conservatisms, making the culture wars around gender global. I conclude, therefore, for today, that this seems to be a uniquely productive moment to de-orientalize scholarship on gender in Muslim societies, to break the shackles of lingering binaries such as tradition, modernity, Islam, secularism, imperialism, national authenticity, and finally locate the politics of gender where it truly belongs. And this is at the front line of democratic struggles everywhere. Thank you.
So our second speaker is Nadia Alali, who is a Robert Family Professor of International Studies and Professor of Anthropology and Middle East Studies at Brown University. And in addition to being one of the editors, Nadia also is the author of the chapter on Iraq in the book. And I think deriving from the Iraqi case, Nadia will discuss the centrality of gender politics, understanding the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and beyond. And the title of her talk is Beyond Imperialism, Gender Politics, Authoritarianism, and Feminist Resistance.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to start out just saying how much of a pleasure and privilege it was to work with Denise, my former supervisor, and Catherine, friend and colleague. I guess what I would say, though, is that although I have been supervising PhD students myself for 20 years, working with Denise, I kind of slipped back into this role. Similar to when I go home and I feel like a 14-year-old girl again. Well, for years, really, since after the invasion of Iraq, I mean, when I worked with Denise, I worked on the concept of secularism in the context of the Egyptian women's movement. But shortly following that, I've been working on Iraq, the impact of sanctions, dictatorship, the regime of Saddam Hussein, and then following that in the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And the first years after the invasion, I would go to events like the Middle East Studies Association, Northern America, or big Iraq conferences. And you had panels discussing sectarianism, panels discussing political transformation, conflict. Inevitably, these panels were men. There were political scientists, historians, IR scholars who would tell us about the developments in Iraq. And then I would be sort of tucked away on a gender studies panel. When I was a PhD student, we were actually referred to as a ladies panel. So that kind of changed slightly by the time I had a PhD. And so, we would talk about all the big things as well, but with a gendered lens. And it was still possible for a long time for the men to get away, to not actually come and listen to us. I mean, we would go to these men-only panels, which were totally gender blind, and we would listen, and you would inevitably ask questions and challenge them, but what about gender? And they didn't have much to say about this. They generally wouldn't come to our panels. I don't know what your experience is, but that has changed. I feel this has changed. There is a greater recognition that we cannot actually understand all the big processes, whether it is increase in authoritarianism, whether it is sectarian politics, whether it is shifts in political economy, political corruption, you name it, without paying attention to the politics of gender. And so my chapter on Iraq does precisely that. It attempts to look at the developments mainly after 2003, although I strongly believe that it's not possible to actually understand Iraq after 2003 without putting it in historical context. We have to understand the dynamics and the shifting gender politics during the Ba'ath regime, and there were different times, periods. I cannot overstate the significance of economic sanctions, which had a devastating impact on Iraqi society in general, but specifically impacted women and gender relations. But then, when we look at developments in Iraq with the rise in sectarian politics, and much of the political tensions and some of the big contestations were revolving around legal issues or also policies where gender was at its center. Most prominently amongst them, the discussions around the personal status code. So this refers to a set of laws that govern marriage, divorce, child custody, and inheritance. And there you had a situation where during the Ba'ath regime, actually predating the Ba'ath regime, there was a relatively progressive, it wasn't progressive, but it was, at least it allowed a woman the right to divorce, and it also allowed the woman to prevent men from getting married to a second or third husband. And also it was a set of laws that applied uniformly to Sunni and Shia Muslims. And so one of the first point of contestation between Shia and Sunni Islamists following the invasion was that law. And and women's bodies, women's sexuality, women's dress code, women's ability to marry, to divorce, to have access to their children after divorce, right to inheritance, became really the battleground between the different Islamist political actors. And also knowing, I mean, including from my own family in Baghdad, there was also uniformly, when you had a militant Islamist group moving into a neighborhood, whether they were Sunni or Shia Islamists, the first thing they would do is to tell women, you have to dress according to Islamic law, you have to cover up, you shouldn't go out. And women's bodies were very much used to control neighborhoods. Now, later on, in terms of the sectarian tensions, it became very obvious that the gendered resistance was actually at the forefront. So you have, despite the political violence, despite increased political repression, you had mushrooming of women's organizations. Some of them, I guess, part of a neoliberal NGOization. There was available funding, quite a bit of money was thrown at Iraq initially. I mean, that didn't last very long. But soon with increase in political violence, sectarian violence, women's organizations were actually operating in very, very risky contexts and had to, some of them actually lost their lives, some of them had to go underground. But I've always been very moved and impressed. Not as much, I mean, it's not similar, I mean, it is similar to the Turkish case, maybe not as much, that, women's rights activists have been at the forefront of actually challenging authoritarian politics in Iraq and challenging sectarian politics. Now, the other, I think, big issue that Denise mentioned, and that is also so evident in the Iraqi case, is yes, of course, when I talked about Iraq initially in 2004, 2005, 2006, it would have been absurd for me to talk about it without reference to the invasion and the occupation, right? It would have also been absurd for me to speak about it without mentioning the impact of economic sanctions on Iraq. But frankly, we're now in 2019, and I get quite frustrated with the ongoing tendency to explain everything that is happening in Iraq with respect to imperialism, neoliberalism, and then of course Zionism is often kind of tucked in there as well. And although it is true that we cannot explain away ISIS without reference to the invasion, and we know that there is a dialectic between the emergence of militia, Islamist militia in Iraq, and politics linked to the military invasion and so on. But there are political actors, there are Iraqi politicians who, many of them who came from abroad, very sectarian, with very sectarian ideas, local militia leaders, religious authorities, tribal leaders, families, in addition to, of course, regional actors. I mean, Iraq, when you think Iraq, you have to think Iran, you have to think Turkey, you have to think Saudi Arabia, who are all sort of fighting a proxy war on the grounds of Iraq. And so I get frustrated with the tendency, and I think that's particularly strong amongst some of my colleagues in the US, who I understand are, of course, challenging US government policy. And if you're based in the US, now that I live there, I mean, I can see it, this is the first impulse. But I think it is misleading and simplistic, and we do need to pay very close attention, and that is of course something that we argue throughout. We need to pay very close attention to the specific historical, empirical context and look at local, national, transnational factors that contribute to the specific politics of gender. Now, moving beyond the Iraq chapter, I think it's so much has happened, of course, since we wrote this book. I mean, Denise mentioned, we are witnessing, history as we go along. I mean, it's like every day. So what struck me, for instance, in relation to recent developments with Turkey's military invasion of northern and eastern Syria, I don't know if you noticed, but in the very beginning, President Erdogan of Turkey actually said, "We are fighting women's terrorism." He mentioned the term women's terrorism. And, it's, to my mind, what really gets him at this point is not that the Kurdish political movement is actually a threat to Turkish national integrity, because actually the Kurdish political movement is not asking for an independent state anymore outside of the autonomous zone in northern eastern Syria. But it's a movement that really has put gender-based equality at its center. And I think that it was not a coincidence that he mentioned the term women's terrorism. Similarly, of course, we see in the Iraqi context recent protest movements. This has been going on actually now for several years, although it is true that right now it is mainly young men on the street fighting political corruption. They're not fighting anymore the US invasion imperialism. They're fighting local and also, of course, regional actors who have been, as far as I know, Iraq is evidently one of the biggest stories of corruption in the history of humankind. It's billions and billions of dollars. We don't know where they went. But again, it is women's organizations who have been very much challenging not just authoritarian rule, but sectarian and corrupt politics in Iraq. And I think on this note, I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Catherine Spellman-Putz, or dear colleague here at ISMC, where she is an associate professor. She's also a visiting professor at Columbia University. The title of her talk is Islam, Geopolitical Conjunctures, Transnational Networks, and Diasporas.
Oh, great. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Sophie, very much. So nice to see you. And to thank Nadia and Denise. It's been an absolute joy, truly, and an honor for me to work with you on this project. So I first met with Denise. Denise is a mentor, a role model, and has become a very dear friend. And I first met Denise when I studied under you in 1991, when I first moved to the UK that very year, which is significant because it's the year that Women, Islam and the State was published. And since then, I have been, over the years, really focusing on religion in the process of migration and settlements, and looking at the interplay between religion and culture, and seeing how religious practices and traditions travel not only across place, but also across time. Now, my work is largely ethnographic, and I would spend a lot of time in seemingly private, informal, and often deemed as theoretically insignificant spaces. So I would spend a lot of time in social gatherings in people's homes. I would spend time around the kitchen table talking with people. I would spend a lot of time in really strange, makeshift community centers all over town. So it's Denise's work that really taught me to link these ethnographic contexts to wider macro structures, because I think they really are important spaces. So although her volume, Women, Islam and the State, did not focus on diasporic settings, it was hugely significant to me and to students and scholars around the world, because it really taught us how to push women's spaces, women's roles, and women's rights onto center stage and really into the analytical frame. So it's a huge gift that Denise has given us. So as already highlighted by Denise and Nadia, since the publication of Women, Islam and the State, transnational networks, geopolitical entanglements, and diasporic activity, both online and off, have become really significant in informing women, gender politics, and activism. Now, all the chapters in the volume have transnational dimensions, and which in turn feed into my chapter, which is the last chapter. Well, I guess there's the epilogue, but the chapter 10 in the book. So you have a lot of the dimensions in the chapters sort of really feed into my work, and I think my chapter feeds back into their chapters. And so my focus was on the so-called Muslim diaspora and the politics that surround Islam and Muslims in Western context. So what I thought I would do is to give an overview of the structure of the central arguments of the chapter and to highlight just some of the material that I have drawn upon. Now, in terms of structure, it's really separated into two different parts. The first part focuses on the making of a so-called Muslim diaspora, or this Muslim exceptionalism, and looking at how gender is very much part of its making. So it argues that gender roles, gender relations, bodily practices have been key ingredients in marking the boundaries between us and them, in Western reifications of Islam, as well as marking differences within and between Muslim subgroupings and Islamic movements. So then part two of the chapter sort of dives inside the diaspora and into this very complex and divergent ways that people have navigated and challenged these pervasive gender ideologies, stereotypes, and collective representations. Now, despite great heterogeneity of Muslims living in Western countries with really diverse demographic profiles, orientations, experiences, there's been an increasing prioritization of Muslim self and group identification on the one hand, and totalizing Muslims into single cultural/political blocs on the other. So homogenizing and profiling Muslims in Western countries is often linked to the post-9/11 geopolitical context. But what I try to do in the chapter is to take a step back and to show that these trends were happening before 9/11. So for example, prior to 9/11, what I did is I crunched a lot of research and came up with three sort of interrelated explanations for the ascendancy of Muslim self and group identification. And these three categories, so first I looked at the politics surrounding the recognition of Islam and Muslim practices in Western liberal structures. Secondly, I looked at the so-called global Muslim awakening and all of its manifestations, including the rise of Islamic transnational movements. And then lastly, I looked at Western responses to Muslim identity politics and Islamic movements, and then the rise of various strands of Islamophobia. So just on the first point, just a couple remarks. I looked, for instance, at the emergence of Muslim umbrella groups that aim to lobby for the accommodation of Islam and Muslim practice within national frameworks. Now, this really varies country to country, depending on particular histories, the way that religion is situated in those histories, political and legal frameworks, and different commitments to secularism. But what they had in common, I found, was the unrepresentative nature of Muslim leadership and authority. So which Muslims from what backgrounds should represent an assumed Muslim community? Whose Islamic theological school and gender norms should serve as exemplars for all? Now, in many cases, it was older, self-appointed male community brokers from religiously conservative backgrounds who sort of jockeyed to fill the positions. And as a result, matters that pertain to women and the family, and I should add that many of the matters, the women groups were dealing with these matters at the grassroots and really working on these different issues, but they were mainly grossly neglected. And this is really ironic, considering women's dress and the question of violence against women, which were often collapsed into one category, were at the core of public debates over Muslim immigration and integration. And there's no time, but I also discussed neoliberal policies, often under the name of austerity, that also mask the ways that women have been marking their political trajectories and setting their own agendas. Now, the way that Islam has been institutionalized in Western states must also be examined in relation to this global Muslim awakening in all of its various manifestations. It's certainly not unitary at all. And the rise of Islamic transnational movements. Okay, so the diverse Muslim awakening has been mainly understood to stem from different sources, including the long-term effects of the Iranian Revolution and the Shia revival. Another important source were the effects of the international missions exporting Salafi teachings through mosques and schools backed by Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries. as well as a very wide array of other forms of grassroots transnational Muslim movements. Now, like I said, these movements cover a wide spectrum, from peaceful piety, quietist movements, to more active militant groups that exert violence. Now, these various currents have been very adept at using the internet and social media to carry various and widely different interpretations of Islamic doctrines, ideologies, and symbols, particularly to younger generations. Disciplining the mind, body, and conduct have been central to Islamic trends, these Islamist trends, and often conveyed by heightened religious awareness, practice, and visibility of Islamic dress, and other outward signs that show the difference between us and them. So the good Muslim in this line of thinking are submissive and pure, and bad Muslims are liberal and impure with loose morals. So the third shift focuses on the Western responses to Muslim identity politics and these sundry Islamic movements. And in the 1990s in particular, we started to see the reactionary othering and the rise of various strands of Islamophobia. For instance, in addition to the sort of typical racist bigots, you also had liberals and leftists who were historically anti-racist activists who also started to question the compatibility of Western and Islamic principles. So perceptions that Muslims posed a threat to Western values, particularly women's equality and LGBTQ rights, were at the heart of public debates. And this was greatly exacerbated after 9/11 attacks in the US, masterminded by Al-Qaeda. So the shock of 9/11, the war on terror, and the devastating effects of the war on terror, and there's a new culture of unprecedented security measures in Western countries, and this is all too familiar to all of us. But additional terrorist attacks on Western soil, the rise of ISIS and anti-Western jihadi networks, sort of the success of recruiting, success of ISIS of recruiting Western-born men and women to serve in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, along with migration influxes, all further justified policy changes. So these conditions prompted many Western states to redefine citizenships and regulate the cultural values that mark national borders. So women's issues, particularly dress, emerged as a central trope in shaping the boundaries of citizenship, legislation, and new forms of nationalism. And what I do in the chapter is I look at some citizenship tests and courses in various countries, and try and show how they try to distinguish good secular-minded Muslims from the bad illiberal ones, especially in relation to gender and sexuality norms. Now, in more recent years, converging populisms, clearly exemplified by Brexit, Trump, and the rise of the far right, have further locked Muslims into a single identity space. And with Trump's chaotic regime of rule, exercised through executive orders like the travel ban, anti-Muslim tweets, and just the dismantling of due process and governance, further feeds this cultural war. And we're really seeing the war. It's a bloody war with the steep rise of white supremacist terrorism. So the constructions of the Muslim man and the Muslim women have consistently been used by both anti-Muslim groups and Islamist groups to define antagonistic group identities and protect dominant gender ideologies. And these measures and countermeasures have created their own noxious dynamic. Missing, of course, are many Muslim voices. So part 2 of the chapter looks inside the diaspora communities. And so drawing on my own ethnographic research, I show what people have to contend with the multiple dynamics of Islamophobia, male-dominated Muslim identity politics, and challenges posed by male-centered gender regimes and power bases, both in the West and back in countries of descent. So I've been really being mindful of the volatile political and social environment and this trend to totalize Muslims in opposition to Western nation states. I've tried to shed light on the complex social and political transformations of specific populations and the varying ways that they respond to the complicated politics that surround us right now. So for example, my ethnographic data on 12 or Shia Muslims in the UK showed how these politicized terrains have deepened communal divisions and impacted gender politics within diaspora communities. So I think it's really important to look at intra-community dynamics among Muslim populations and how all of these politics are affecting the relations and communal boundaries within and between. So although women continue to be deployed as markers of culture and traditions, there is an acute awareness of the hurdles that Muslim women and men face living in Western societies. Now, women have long created and employed a wide range of tools, platforms, and strategies to challenge gender ideologies and inequalities in their host countries and home countries. And this is coming from very diverse political and religious standpoints. Transnational feminist networks, for instance, have created many spaces for women to organize and reinforce advocacy work and campaigns across borders and social barriers. What I argue in the second part of the chapter is that the effectiveness of women's national and transnational mobilization really depends on its capability to involve women at the grassroots in seemingly informal spaces and to understand the changing factors that are affecting daily life. So ultimately, with the sort of salience of negativity surrounding Islam, it is vital to amplify local struggles and the very creative ways that women and men are transcending gendered representations and the so-called Muslim diaspora, and to assert a more nuanced vision of their diversity. Thank you.